They say the desert forgets. They are wrong. Beneath the suffocating silence of Arabia's empty quarter, a city once pulsed with forbidden wealth. Frankincense, more precious than gold, bled from its walls, feeding empires, fueling gods. Then, without warning, it vanished. Not conquered, not abandoned, swallowed. The sands closed like a fist, erasing towers, caravans, lives, leaving only whispers. Centuries later, the Quran spoke of it, Iram of the Pillars, the city of the tribe of Ad, obliterated by divine wrath, toppled like an arrogant monument. Bedouins muttered its name in fear. European adventurers hunted it like a phantom. Lawrence of Arabia called it the Atlantis of the sands, a kingdom half legend, half curse. For decades, the desert mocked those who sought it. Maps turned to lies, tracks dissolved overnight, until a cold, mechanical eye pierced the void, NASA satellites scanning the dunes, uncovering ghostly caravan scars etched into earth older than empires. The trail led to Shizr, Oman, a crumbled fortress, a gaping sinkhole, a place where the ground itself betrayed the living. Was this Ubar? A city? A fortress? A mirage masquerading as truth? The desert gave no answer. It only breathed, patient, watching, as if daring anyone to claim certainty where certainty is death. The legend of Ubar begins not with archaeology or modern maps, but with words, lines of poetry spoken before the rise of Islam, preserved in fragments that spoke of a land of towers, of arrogance, of a people who built too high and fell too hard. Pre-Islamic poets spoke of Iram, a place marked by its pillars, immense and imposing. The words carried a tone of warning, a story passed not for entertainment but for remembrance, the kind of remembrance that survives through generations because it bears the weight of punishment. These verses spoke of the tribe of Ad, descendants of Noah's son Shem, men of power who believed their strength could resist time itself. Their arrogance, the poets said, drew the wrath of God, and their great city, this Iram, was swallowed by sand, extinguished without trace. When the Quran was recited in the 7th century, it reinforced this memory, giving it an unshakable authority. In Surah Al-Far 89:6-8, the words still strike with precision. Have you not seen how your Lord dealt with Ad, Iram of the Pillars, whose like had never been created in the lands? The passage is not a legend dressed in metaphor, but a stark historical remembrance of a people annihilated for their defiance. Islamic tradition explains that the people of Ad ignored the prophet Hud, mocked divine warnings, and built their city as an expression of pride. Their punishment came not as war or famine but as a natural force, an unrelenting wind that raged for 7 nights and 8 days, leaving them lifeless as hollow trunks of palm trees, their city lost beneath the sands. The Quran fixed the story into sacred memory, ensuring Iram would never slip fully into myth, even as its exact location vanished. For the Bedouin tribes who wandered the deserts of Oman and Yemen, the legend was not confined to scripture. It lived in their oral traditions, whispered around campfires, repeated as warnings to those who placed too much faith in stone and wealth. They spoke of a city swallowed by the desert itself, a place cursed by God, where anyone who searched too long might be consumed. The shifting sands of the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, were seen as a veil cast deliberately over the ruins. Some travelers claimed to see shapes of walls or towers rising at the horizon before vanishing again. Others told of camels sinking suddenly, as if into hollow ground, the desert devouring intruders as it had once devoured a city. The Bedouins did not write histories, but their words carried weight. For centuries, geographers and historians in the Islamic world echoed these tales. The 10th century historian Al-Masudi mentioned Iram as a city that once thrived in the southern deserts, aligning with the incense routes that carried frankincense from Dhofar and Hadramaut toward Mesopotamia and the Levant. Al-Hamadani, writing in the 10th century as well, included references to the vanished city in his works. The memory persisted in Islamic literature not as a distant legend but as part of the geography of Arabia, half seen, half remembered, but always feared. When European travelers entered Arabia centuries later, they found themselves captivated by this tale. In the 19th century, Explorers such as Bertram Thomas and later Wilfred Thesiger ventured into the empty quarter, hearing from Bedouins the same stories that had survived since antiquity. They were not tales softened by time but stories repeated with conviction. A city buried under the dunes, cursed, waiting. To Western ears, the legend immediately drew comparison with Plato's Atlantis, a once great civilization erased, leaving no trace but legend. The desert, like the sea, concealed what had once been alive. T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, carried the fascination further. Writing in the early 20th century, he referred to Ubar as the Atlantis of the sands, a phrase that would grip the Western imagination. Lawrence was not alone. European Orientalists, geographers, and adventurers latched onto the myth, blending local accounts with biblical and Quranic references, creating a portrait of Ubar as a lost metropolis, a city of unimaginable wealth toppled in a single catastrophic moment. For them, the empty quarter was not only the largest sand desert in the world but a crypt, hiding a forgotten chapter of human history. Yet the blending of traditions, scriptures, and folklore created a layered, shifting picture. Islamic tradition tied Iram to divine punishment, a moral warning carried into eternity. Bedouin oral histories emphasized the desert's treachery, portraying the city's destruction as part of a continuing danger. European adventurers, on the other hand, clothed the legend in the language of mystery and romantic ruin, comparing it with Atlantis and El Dorado. The result was a myth that no single culture owned. Every retelling shaped it differently, yet each was tied to the same haunting absence: the ruins that could never be found. The story carried a peculiar persistence. Unlike Atlantis, which was described in a single text by Plato, Iram appeared in multiple traditions: Quranic verses, Arab histories, Bedouin tales, Western reports. This multiplicity gave it weight. It was not a creation of one mind but a thread running through centuries of memory. Each culture that encountered the legend sharpened it further, adding layers of fear, awe, and longing. By the early 20th century, as Western mapping of Arabia intensified, the mystery of Ubar became almost an obsession. Explorers carried the stories of Bedouins into European salons and lecture halls, where audiences imagined a city of columns lying beneath the shifting dunes, waiting for science to expose it. The British fascination with Arabia, tied to imperial ambitions and oil interests, only amplified the legend. Every expedition into the empty quarter risked death, yet each promised the possibility of stepping onto the ruins of a lost civilization mentioned in the Quran. And always, the desert remained silent. The Rub al-Khali stretched endlessly, an ocean of dunes larger than France, lifeless, without rivers or oases. The very scale of it seemed to mock human effort. Caravans that attempted to cross often vanished, their bones later uncovered by winds that shifted without warning. To the Bedouin, this was proof that Iram's destruction had never ended. The punishment was ongoing, the desert itself alive, hostile to human intrusion. For the Europeans, this silence only deepened the allure. They returned from the desert empty-handed, but they returned convinced, carrying sketches, notes, and maps that suggested Ubar lay just beyond the last dune they had not crossed. By the middle of the 20th century, the story of Ubar, Atlantis of the sands, was no longer simply Arab legend or Quranic memory. It had become a global riddle, the kind of mystery that blurred the line between faith and history, myth and archaeology. It was not only about whether a city had existed but about why it had vanished, why no ruins had ever been uncovered despite centuries of searching. A city remembered by poets, sanctified in scripture, whispered of by tribes, hunted by explorers, and yet absent, as if erased deliberately. The story stood suspended in time, caught between sacred text and shifting sand, between the voice of Bedouins and the pens of Europeans. It remained untouchable, a legend so enduring that even in silence, it grew louder, calling out from beneath the desert that had swallowed it whole. The Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, is the largest continuous sand desert on Earth, an expanse stretching over 650,000 square kilometers, covering much of present-day Saudi Arabia, spilling into Oman, the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. It is a place without permanent rivers, without reliable oases, a land where survival is stripped to its barest form. Temperatures can rise past 50 degrees Celsius in summer, while rainfall in some stretches has not surpassed a few millimeters in decades. To those who walked its fringes, the desert was not only a landscape but a verdict, merciless, absolute, indifferent to the ambitions of men. Yet within this unforgiving expanse, human history carved routes of staggering importance, lines in the sand that determined the fate of kingdoms. Southern Arabia was once the beating heart of one of the world's most coveted commodities, frankincense. From the Dhofar Mountains of Oman and the valleys of Hadramaut in Yemen flowed the resin of the Boswellia sacred tree, a product burned in temples, demanded by priests, prized by kings. Egypt craved it for funerary rites as early as the reign of Pharaoh Hatshepsut in the 15th century BCE, when inscriptions at Deir el-Bahari celebrated expeditions to the land of Punt, likely connected to southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, in pursuit of incense-bearing trees. The Babylonians used it in ritual ceremonies, the Persians in fire temples, the Greeks and Romans in their vast pantheon of religious practices. By the time of Augustus in the 1st century BCE, Rome's appetite for frankincense was insatiable, fueling a trade network that moved from the ports of Cana in Hadramaut through Arabia to Gaza on the Mediterranean. Strabo, writing in the 1st century CE, described the staggering revenues frankincense produced for South Arabian kingdoms. The incense road was not a single path, but a network of arteries stretching across deserts and mountains, linking the source of the resin to the empires that demanded it. Caravans numbering hundreds, sometimes thousands, of camels transported the resin northward. Each stop along the route was measured not in distance but in survival. Wells, forts, and caravanserais arose at critical intervals, turning barren stretches into lifelines. Settlements grew where geography allowed water to surface or where rulers imposed control, taxing the trade and enriching their treasuries. The kingdoms of Saba, Hadramaut, Kataban, and Himyar flourished on this wealth, becoming known to outsiders not only as Arabia Felix, Fortunate Arabia, but as lands where luxury was born from the very trees that clung to desert cliffs. The empty quarter itself was not hospitable to permanent settlement, but it was not devoid of movement. Routes skirted its edges, hugging mountain ranges and desert rims, avoiding the most lifeless heart of the sands. Yet the existence of caravan tracks crisscrossing the southern reaches of the Rub al-Khali shows that even here, paths of commerce cut across the void. Archaeological and satellite evidence later revealed the scars of these roads, worn by centuries of camels pressing across gravel plains and dunes, proving that trade had once penetrated where today there is silence. These routes were the veins through which frankincense flowed, linking Oman's mountains with the wider Arabian Peninsula. It is within this context that the legend of Ubar begins to take a sharper form. For centuries, Ubar was spoken of as a city of grandeur, but modern analysis suggests it may have been something more practical, yet no less vital, a hub on the incense trade network, a fortified outpost where caravans converged. Shizr in Oman, excavated in the 1990s, revealed a stone fortress dating from the early centuries CE, with towers, storerooms, and a deep well. Its placement was strategic, at the edge of the empty quarter, guarding the route from Dhofar to the north. Archaeologists such as Juris Zurins, who studied the site, proposed that Ubar was less a single metropolis and more a regional name for a trade system, a loose network of settlements and forts anchoring the incense road. The myth of towers reaching into the sky may have been born not from a vast city but from the formidable architecture of such fortresses, amplified through centuries of retelling. The economics of frankincense explain why even a single fortified station could gain legendary status. Resin was harvested by cutting the bark of Boswellia trees, collecting the gum that hardened into pearls of incense. The process was laborious, the yield limited, and the value immense. In the 1st century CE, Pliny the Elder wrote in his Natural History that frankincense could be sold in Rome for up to 6 denarii per pound, an immense cost in relation to daily wages of Roman workers. Control of the trade was jealously guarded. The South Arabian kingdoms imposed strict monopolies, protecting their caravans with armed escorts, exacting tolls at checkpoints, and ensuring that only certain ports could ship incense abroad. Any settlement that functioned as a choke point on the route, like Ubar, would wield power disproportionate to its size. Geography reinforced this necessity. The monsoon climate of Dhofar allowed boswellia trees to grow, but once the resin was collected, it had to be transported north through desert terrain. The coastal route was treacherous, with rocky cliffs and limited harbors, forcing much of the trade inland. The incense road's path through the Arabian interior demanded stations where caravans could water camels, store supplies, and negotiate passage. Shizr, perched at the edge of the desert, provided access to underground aquifers, making it a crucial oasis. This explains why its ruins show evidence of repeated construction phases, expansion, and collapse, a cycle of building and abandonment tied directly to the ebb and flow of trade. Historical references to the incense road consistently underscore its global importance. By the 3rd century CE, demand for frankincense had begun to wane in the Mediterranean world as Christianity spread and pagan rituals declined. Yet the road's infrastructure had already shaped Arabia. Entire towns owed their existence to this trade. Marib, the ancient capital of Saba, thrived on caravan taxation, with its massive dam regulating water for agriculture. Qana served as a maritime hub, where incense was shipped across the Arabian Sea to India. Even Petra in modern-day Jordan rose to prominence as a caravan city, collecting duties from incense passing through its gates. Ubar's role, though smaller in scale, fits within this grand lattice of commerce. The harshness of the Arabian desert forged a paradox. The more inhospitable the land, the more valuable the nodes of passage became. A single well could define the fate of hundreds of men and beasts. Control of these wells was equivalent to control of the trade itself. This is why Ubar, whether as city or fortress, drew such attention. It was never simply about walls and towers. It was about mastery over the arteries of survival in a desert that granted nothing freely. As empires rose and fell, the desert remained, unmoved, stretching its sands over abandoned routes, erasing tracks that once linked Oman to Gaza, Hadramaut to Alexandria, Saba to Rome. The incense road endured for over a millennium, sustaining civilizations, shaping kingdoms, dictating wars and alliances. And somewhere within that shifting geography Ubar stood, whether as a fortified well, a bustling outpost, or a collective memory of many such settlements, its name preserved while its stones were buried. The harsh landscape and the relentless demand for incense had elevated it, and the same desert that had sustained its power would eventually consume its remains. The search for Ubar did not begin with science. It began with obsession, Europe's hunger for vanished cities, for names spoken in scripture but absent in stone. By the 19th century, Arabia had become the blankiest space on imperial maps. The Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, was a void stretching across more than 500,000 square kilometers, unmarked by rivers or towns, a territory avoided even by its own inhabitants except in the rarest of necessity. To European explorers, it was the last silence left on Earth, and into that silence they projected the legend of a city lost beneath sand. The first serious attempts came in the early decades of the 20th century. Bertram Thomas, a British civil servant and traveler, crossed the southern Arabian desert in 1930 to 1931, becoming the first Westerner to do so. His crossing was not an act of idle curiosity, it was political. Serving in the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman, Thomas had long cultivated relationships with Bedouin tribes, negotiating treaties, gathering intelligence, and learning the desert from those who lived in its margins. In his book Arabia Felix, 1932, he described not only his crossing but also the whispers of a city swallowed by sand, a place the Bedouins spoke of with unease. Thomas treated these accounts with respect, but he could not verify them. The desert yielded no ruins, only endless dunes. Yet his account planted a seed. If the Bedouins still spoke of Ubar, perhaps it was more than myth. Thomas was followed by another figure whose name became synonymous with Arabia, Wilfrid Thesiger. Born in 1910, educated at Eton and Oxford, Thesiger turned his back on conventional life and sought purpose in the most remote landscapes. Between 1945 and 1950, he twice crossed the empty quarter, living with the Rashid and the Bedouin, earning their trust by sharing in their hardships. His classic memoir Arabian Sands, 1959, remains one of the most vivid records of desert life. Yet Thesiger approached the legend of Ubar with skepticism. He noted the stories but emphasized that the Rub al-Khali was not the place of grand cities. It was a land where even survival was precarious. To him, Ubar belonged to the realm of tradition, a tale that carried moral weight rather than archaeological promise. But while Thomas and Thesiger approached Ubar with discipline, another man gave it wings of myth. Thomas Edward Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, transformed the story through the power of imagination. Lawrence never set foot in the empty quarter, yet he shaped Western understanding of Ubar more than any man who had. In his writings during and after the First World War, Lawrence referred to Ubar as the Atlantis of the Sands, a phrase that electrified the Western public. By equating it with Plato's Lost Island, Lawrence lifted Ubar from the deserts of Arabia into the universal pantheon of vanished civilizations. His words were not based on archaeology but on the romantic tradition of European Orientalism, which saw Arabia as a land of mystery, danger, and buried grandeur. Once he named it Atlantis, the myth hardened. Ubar ceased to be a tribal tale. It became a target for Western explorers, journalists, and archaeologists alike. The problem was the desert itself. The Rub al-Khali was not an obstacle one could simply walk into. Its heat, reaching 50 degrees Celsius, killed the unprepared within days. Its dunes, some rising over 250 meters, shifted endlessly, erasing tracks, swallowing caravans. Wells were scarce, separated by distances too great for men or camels to cross unaided. Even the Bedouins, who knew its fringes, refused to venture far into its heart. European explorers faced another barrier: politics. The Arabian Peninsula in the 19th and early 20th centuries was a fractured landscape of tribal alliances, emirates, and sultanates, guarded jealously against intrusion. Foreigners required tribal protection, and even then risked hostility. The desert was not only a natural fortress but also a political one. These realities shaped early hypotheses about Ubar's existence. Some Orientalists suggested that the city was entirely mythical, a moral parable embedded in the Quran and Bedouin folklore. Others argued it might refer to an entire region rather than a city, a name for the trade network of the incense routes rather than a single place. By the late 19th century, European cartographers began tentatively placing Ubar on maps of southern Arabia, not based on evidence but on speculation drawn from tribal stories. These guesses further blurred the line between geography and legend. Yet the fascination would not die. The notion of a great city buried beneath dunes was too alluring to abandon. Lawrence's romanticization kept it alive in the Western imagination, fueling articles, lectures, and expeditions. Bertram Thomas hinted that he had heard of a place known to the Arabs as Ubar in his accounts, and Western audiences seized upon the similarity to Ubar. In 1932, Harry St. John Philby, another British explorer, reported the discovery of strange glassy fragments in the sands of Saudi Arabia, later identified as evidence of a meteorite impact at the site known as Ubar. Though unrelated to the legend of Ubar, the coincidence of names caused confusion, with some claiming the impact site itself was the lost city. This blending of science and speculation further entrenched Ubar's mystique. By the mid-20th century, skepticism grew louder. Scholars such as the British historian John Philby and others argued that no grand city could ever have thrived in the empty quarter. The absence of permanent water sources, the instability of sand dunes, and the lack of archaeological remains all suggested that Ubar was a tale that had grown over centuries from smaller truths. Still, the myth persisted, kept alive by the sheer persistence of the desert's silence. The absence of proof became, paradoxically, its own kind of evidence. If the sands could bury caravans overnight, why not entire settlements? This tension, between the sheer difficulty of the desert and the irresistible pull of the legend, defined the Western search for Ubar. Thomas crossed it, Thesiger lived in it, Lawrence mythologized it, and countless lesser-known travelers risked death within it, all pulled by the same shadow. Some returned with notes and maps, others with nothing but stories, yet none returned with Ubar. For over a century, the sands gave nothing back. forcing historians and explorers alike to confront the possibility that Ubar might not exist as they imagined. The legend lingered because it lived at the intersection of scripture, geography, and imperial imagination. It was a place both specific and ungraspable, tied to coordinates yet always receding. It belonged equally to the Bedouins who whispered of it and to the Europeans who charted it on maps they never verified. It was myth and hypothesis, prophecy and rumor, scripture and speculation, all fused together in the silence of the Rub al-Khali, a silence that refused to give an answer. By the mid-20th century, the myth of Ubar stood suspended between faith and skepticism. Traditional explorers had exhausted the limits of their endurance in the Rub al-Khali, returning with tales, maps, and fragments of Bedouin lore, but never with stone ruins that could silence doubt. The desert had beaten them all, yet technology was advancing faster than sand could cover its traces. Where men failed, machines began to look with eyes that did not tire, instruments that could see what lay hidden beneath dunes. For the first time in centuries, the silence of the empty quarter was challenged not by caravans or compasses, but by science. The first step came from above. Aerial surveys, initially military tools, were redirected toward archaeology after the Second World War. In the 1920s and 1930s, British Royal Air Force pilots had already mapped stretches of Mesopotamia from the air, their photographs exposing ancient canals, roads, and city outlines invisible from the ground. The technique, once seen as a novelty, had by the 1950s become indispensable. Archaeologists began to realize that what desert winds erased on the surface could still leave faint scars in soil, visible only when viewed from the air. By the 1960s, aerial archaeology was exposing ancient fortifications across Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. But Arabia remained largely inaccessible. Its political borders closed, its deserts hostile. The empty quarter remained a blank, beyond the reach of planes and researchers alike. That barrier shifted in the late 20th century with the rise of remote sensing. The American space program, driven by Cold War rivalries, produced not only rockets and satellites but a revolution in vision. By the 1970s, satellites like Landsat were capturing multispectral images of the Earth, able to register variations in vegetation, soil, and rock that no human eye could see. Archaeologists quickly understood the potential. Caravan routes, worn by centuries of camels and wagons, left subtle depressions in the ground, invisible to travelers but detectable from orbit. Ancient walls, even when buried, sometimes altered soil moisture, producing patterns satellites could register. Technology developed for surveillance and military strategy became a tool for resurrecting the past. The decisive moment for Ubar came in the late 1980s. Nicholas Clapp, an American documentary filmmaker with a background in archaeology, had long been fascinated by the legend of Iram. Unlike earlier writers, Clapp approached the problem with both literary and scientific conviction. He sought evidence rather than speculation, but he was willing to use the most modern means available. His determination led him to NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, in Pasadena, California, where scientists were experimenting with satellite radar images of Earth's surface. The technology, originally tested on the shuttle imaging radar missions in 1981 and 1984, was capable of penetrating dry sand and revealing features beneath the desert surface. Clapp, working with JPL specialists such as Ronald Blum, requested that they analyze radar images of southern Arabia. The results were extraordinary. The images revealed a network of faint, ancient caravan tracks converging toward a single point in the Dhofar region of Oman. These were not modern roads but pathways worn into the earth by centuries of movement, routes invisible on the ground yet etched permanently into the soil. The convergence suggested a central hub, a place where trade had passed for millennia. For those who knew the legend, the implication was immediate. This was the shadow of Ubar. The technology did not act alone. Clapp sought confirmation from the field. He enlisted Sir Ranulph Fiennes, a British adventurer famed for his polar expeditions, to assist in the ground survey. Together with Omani archaeologists and officials, they began excavations at the site identified by the satellite's Shizr, a small settlement on the edge of the Rub al-Khali. In 1992, Their work revealed ruins unlike anything expected. A massive fortress, built of cut stone, with towers rising once to 10 meters, emerged from the sand. Beneath it lay a deep well, evidence that the site had been a critical water source. Surrounding layers contained pottery shards dating to different centuries, from Roman to Islamic eras, proving the site had been occupied repeatedly across time. But the most striking feature was absence. Part of the fortress appeared to have collapsed into a vast sinkhole. The ground itself had betrayed the settlement, swallowing walls and structures into the void. This collapse offered a tangible explanation for the ancient tradition. A city or fort swallowed by the sands. What had once sounded like myth was now materialized in geology. The excitement was immediate. In the early 1990s, newspapers across the world proclaimed the lost city of Ubar had been found. Clapp published his account, The Road to Ubar, 1999, detailing the combination of Bedouin stories, Quranic references, satellite images, and excavations that led to Shizr. For a moment, it seemed the mystery had reached resolution. The legend spoken by pre-Islamic poets, fixed in the Quran, sought by Lawrence and Thomas, had finally yielded to science. Yet even here, the sands of truth shifted. Scholars who examined the ruins argued that Shizr was not a great city but a fortified outpost, a caravan station along the incense trade routes. Juris Zurins, an archaeologist involved in the excavation, proposed that Ubar was not one site but a term for an entire region and trade system. Shizr, he argued, was only one of several hubs, but its dramatic collapse into the sinkhole made it emblematic. In this interpretation, the legend had amplified a historical truth. The ruin of trade centers along the incense road, remembered as the fall of a singular city. The science remained undeniable. Remote sensing had revealed what the naked eye never could. The caravan routes were real, visible from space as ancient scars beneath the dunes. The fortress was real, a node in the incense economy of Arabia. And the sinkhole was real, a geological event that lent power to centuries of stories. Whether this was Ubar or one of its shadows mattered less than the fact that science had breached the silence of the empty quarter. For the first time, the desert had been forced to yield evidence that matched its myths. The partnership between advanced technology and traditional archaeology at Shizr reshaped the discipline. It proved that satellite imaging, once reserved for military surveillance, could serve history. It showed that legends dismissed as myth could sometimes conceal distorted fragments of truth, accessible only when viewed from new heights. And it confirmed that the Rub al-Khali, long thought impenetrable, could be read like a palimpsest when machines saw what men could not. The hunt for Ubar had shifted from the sweat of explorers to the silent eyes of satellites. The narrative no longer depended on the strength of a caravan crossing but on radar pulses bouncing off hidden ground. In the space of a decade, the search moved from compasses to computers, from oral tales to multispectral imagery. And within that transition, the line between legend and history blurred further, carried now by both Bedouin voices and NASA data, both ancient Quranic verses and modern excavation trenches. The desert, for centuries invulnerable, had been forced open, not by men with camels but by science that stared down from orbit. In 1992, the desert gave up a fragment of its silence. At Shizr, in southern Oman on the edge of the Rub al-Khali, a team of archaeologists broke into the ground and exposed the remains of what had long been sought, the ruins of a fortress-like settlement buried beneath centuries of sand. The excavation, directed by an Omani-American team that included archaeologist Juris Zurins and supported by Nicholas Clapp's collaboration with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, seemed to give substance to the legendary Ubar. The coordinates that had first been traced from satellite radar now corresponded to walls and stone blocks underfoot. The desert had shifted from rumor to evidence. The ruins revealed themselves as more than scattered stones. The archaeologists identified a massive fortress, its walls built of squared limestone blocks, laid with a solidity that suggested not a mere campsite but a permanent, defensible structure. For corner towers had once anchored the complex, each rising nearly 10 meters before time and erosion had reduced them. Within the enclosure were rooms and storage areas, suggesting organized use, not transient habitation. The walls bore the marks of successive occupations, rebuilt and patched across different centuries. This was not a place erected for a season, but a node on a trade route that carried wealth across Arabia. Artifacts confirmed the site's position in a network of commerce. Pottery fragments were recovered in abundance. Some pieces traced to the Parthian and Sasanian periods, while others aligned with later Islamic centuries. The variety showed that Shizr had not been bound to a single moment in history but had persisted across ages, absorbing the traffic of caravan trade and the shifting powers of empires. The pottery testified to long-distance exchange, a circulation of goods that ran from southern Arabia northward into Mesopotamia and westward toward the Levant. The settlement was not isolated. It was a hinge in the incense trade, the lifeline that once bound the ancient world to the wealth of frankincense. At the heart of the site lay water. Excavation revealed a large well, its shaft descending more than 60 feet into the earth, lined with stone. This well was no minor feature but the key to Shizr's endurance. In the Rub al-Khali, water determined survival. A fortified settlement that guarded such a source could command caravans, levy taxes, and regulate trade. The presence of this well confirmed that Shizr was not only a rest stop but a strategic stronghold, anchored by control of the one element without which no desert crossing was possible. Then came the revelation that drew myth into alignment with geology. Part of the fortress had collapsed into a vast sinkhole, a gaping void that pulled down stone walls and towers into its depths. The collapse was not metaphor but physical fact. Bedrock in the region was riddled with limestone caverns, susceptible to erosion and sudden subsidence. Over centuries, the weight of construction and the drawing of water may have weakened the ground until, abruptly, it gave way. Where once towers stood, there was now absence. The ancient story of a settlement, swallowed by the sands, acquired a tangible correlate. The desert had not risen to bury the city, but the earth beneath it had betrayed its foundation. The sinkhole became the most compelling link between the Shizr site and the legend of Ubar. For centuries, Arab oral tradition spoke of a city that defied God's will, only to vanish beneath the sands in punishment. European writers, influenced by T.E. Lawrence and Bertram Thomas, compared it to Atlantis. Here, at Shizr, the ruin itself seemed to provide the physical echo of that myth, a fortress literally consumed by the ground. The symbolism was irresistible. Scholars and journalists alike seized upon the image of Ubar as a city obliterated not by conquest but by the desert's own forces. Yet debate followed as swiftly as celebration. The ruins at Shizr were substantial, but were they the lost city described in legend? Some archaeologists argued that Ubar had been exaggerated into myth over centuries, and that Shizr was only one of several fortified caravanserais that marked the incense route. Juris Zurins himself proposed that Ubar was not a single city but a term for the broader incense trade network that flourished between the 3rd millennium BCE and the early centuries of the Common Era. In this interpretation, Shizr was one node in a chain of outposts, its dramatic sinkhole collapse ensuring that it was remembered more vividly than others. The debate intensified because the excavation produced not a grand metropolis but a fortified settlement, important, but not a city of marble palaces or sprawling avenues. Those who expected Atlantis in the desert confronted instead a fortress that could house traders, soldiers, and administrators, but not tens of thousands of inhabitants. Its importance lay in its function as a choke point on the incense trade, not in monumental urban scale. The findings showed a site of regional significance, deeply tied to the economy of frankincense, but not the seat of a vanished empire. Still, the Shizr ruins could not be dismissed. The caravan routes traced by NASA's satellite images all converged upon this very point. For centuries, traders had been drawn to the well, to the stronghold that guarded it, and to the safety its walls offered in a hostile desert. The accumulation of pottery, the succession of repairs to the fortifications, and the artifacts found in the debris showed continual occupation over long spans of time. The convergence of trade routes suggested that, whatever name it bore, Shizr had been central to the lifeline of Arabia. The excavation also revealed evidence of wide-ranging contacts. Glass beads, metal objects, and imported ceramics pointed to exchange with regions far beyond Oman. Such findings underscored the reach of the incense trade, which carried frankincense northward to Nabatean Petra, across the Mediterranean, and into Rome itself. Chizer's role as a fortified trade hub connected it to the great economic currents of antiquity. The sinkhole remained the most striking and controversial element. Its collapse suggested why the site may have been abandoned and why memory preserved it in legend. Bedouin traditions spoke of a place where the ground had opened, swallowing walls and towers. The Quran described Iram of the Pillars as a city punished for arrogance. European Orientalists fused these accounts into the romantic notion of Ubar. At Chizer, geology, oral tradition, and written text intersected. The fort had stood. The earth had failed. The memory had endured. The excavation at Chizer did not close the question of Ubar, but it provided the first concrete evidence in centuries of something that could be aligned with it. Whether fortress, caravanserai, or city, the ruins bore the weight of centuries of trade and collapse. The debate over whether Chizer was Ubar or merely one of its fragments remained unresolved, but the power of the site lay in its capacity to anchor myth to stone, to tie the intangible to the physical. The desert had given a trace of its hidden archive, and once exposed, it refused to let the conversation end. The myth of Ubar was always larger than the stones it could rest upon. For centuries, it had been described in terms that made it sound like Atlantis in the desert, a city of immeasurable wealth swallowed by sand in an act of divine retribution. But when archaeologists in the late 20th century began placing evidence against story, a different picture emerged, one that was less romantic but more historically grounded. The consensus formed gradually, shaped by excavation, satellite imaging, and comparative study. Ubar was not a vast metropolis of marble palaces and golden streets, but rather a network of fortified trading outposts, caravanserais, and small settlements strung across the incense routes of southern Arabia. The myth had inflated reality, as myths often do, yet the inflation itself was part of its endurance. The settlement at Chizer in Oman became the focal point of this analysis. Excavated in 1992, its limestone fortress, towers, and collapsed sinkhole initially led many to declare the rediscovery of the fabled city. But archaeologists like Juris Zurins pressed for precision. What stood at Chizer was not a city in the classical sense. It was a fortified caravanserai, a structure built to guard water supplies, provide protection for traders, and assert control over routes carrying frankincense from the Dhofar Mountains toward markets in Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean. The walls that survived, measuring roughly 3 meters thick, spoke of defense, not grandeur. The artifacts, pottery, beads, and imported ceramics, spoke of commerce, not empire. What had been found was historically significant, yet categorically different from the imagined Atlantis of the sands. The persistence of the myth can be traced to the way memory and imagination transform the functional into the legendary. In antiquity, the incense trade was the source of southern Arabia's wealth. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested from boswellia and conifer trees, were burned in temples from Jerusalem to Rome, their value exceeding gold at certain points. Control over this trade gave small kingdoms immense prestige. To outsiders, the idea of cities that grew rich from incense invited exaggeration. When these cities fell silent, abandoned as trade routes shifted and demand declined in late antiquity, memory filled the void with grandeur. A fortified station like Chizer could, in the imagination of later storytellers, expand into a city of soaring pillars, so magnificent that its fall demanded supernatural punishment. Western Orientalists of the 19th and 20th centuries amplified this distortion. T.E. Lawrence, who never visited Chizer, called Ubar the Atlantis of the sands in his romantic writings about Arabia. Bertram Thomas, crossing parts of the Rub al-Khali in 1930-31, recorded Bedouin tales of a vanished city swallowed by the desert. Wilfred Thesiger, traversing the empty quarter in the 1940s, noted similar traditions but treated them cautiously. European explorers, operating in an age when the lost cities of antiquity, Nineveh, Troy, Persepolis, were being brought back into visibility through excavation, projected that same framework onto Arabia. Ubar became a lost city in their imagination because the intellectual climate of the time demanded lost cities to be found. In Islamic tradition, the name that carries closest resemblance is Iram, mentioned in the Quran as Iram of the Pillars, Quran 89:6-7. A city punished by God for arrogance and wiped from the earth. Scholars of Islamic exegesis debated whether Iram referred to a tribe, a city, or an entire region. Over centuries, folk traditions blended this Quranic reference with oral tales of vanished towns in the desert, producing a composite legend. When European explorers sought Ubar, they often equated it directly with Iram, though the connection remains uncertain. The layering of myth, Quranic reference, Bedouin oral tradition, and European romanticism produced a narrative that bore little resemblance to the small but important trading stations that archaeology now documents. Archaeologists argue that Ubar, if the name is to be used at all, referred to a region or a trade network rather than a singular monumental city. Nicholas Clapp, whose persistence brought NASA imaging into the search, admitted after the Shizr excavation that what had been uncovered was not a city in the sense Lawrence imagined. Jurist Zurins advanced the interpretation that Ubar was a kind of region, not a city, encompassing the incense trade system itself. In this model, Shizr was one fortified hub among several, its collapse into a sinkhole ensuring its survival in memory. What gave Shizr its weight in legend was not its scale but the drama of its disappearance. The persistence of the myth is instructive. Small trading posts, by their very nature, fade into obscurity. Few would remember a caravanserai, even a fortified one, centuries after its abandonment. But when oral tradition attaches to it the language of arrogance, punishment, and sudden destruction, its memory expands beyond its historical footprint. The desert, vast and unforgiving, provided the perfect canvas upon which storytellers could magnify. A place that controlled water, taxed caravans, and profited from incense became, in narrative, a city of wealth and defiance. Its fall into geological collapse became divine judgment. Myth enlarged fact because myth better served cultural memory. In Arab identity, the story of Ubar resonates as part of a larger continuum of vanished civilizations. Just as Awith Makrandi and Thamud are remembered in the Quran as tribes destroyed for their hubris, Ubar embodies the theme of wealth undone by arrogance. It is a cautionary tale woven into cultural consciousness. For Bedouin communities, references to Ubar evoke not archaeology but moral lesson. The desert consumes those who believe themselves invincible. In the Western imagination, Ubar became something different. For Europeans, its legend belonged in the same category as Atlantis, El Dorado, or Timbuktu, a place of fabulous wealth concealed beyond reach. The harshness of the Rub al-Khali, the largest sand desert in the world, amplified this perception. The very difficulty of reaching it transformed it into a forbidden zone, and therefore whatever might lie within had to be extraordinary. By the late 20th century, when satellite technology finally located caravan routes beneath the dunes, the myth had already hardened. The reality, a fortress at Shizr, was historically important but narratively smaller than what people expected. Yet rather than erasing the myth, the findings reinforced it, for myth thrives not on fact but on suggestion. The archaeological consensus now holds steady. Ubar was not a grand desert city but a set of fortified way stations tied to the frankincense trade. Shizr was one of them, its dramatic geological collapse granting it prominence in memory. Yet myths continue to inflate these facts, because myth provides meaning where history offers complexity. The endurance of Ubar in both Arab and Western imagination shows how the past is shaped not only by what is built or lost, but by how it is remembered and retold. The name Ubar lingers today not only in archaeological reports but in the vast terrain of modern imagination. Its story, once confined to Bedouin oral tradition and Quranic echoes of Iram of the Pillars, has been pulled into the machinery of global media, literature, and documentary production. By the late 20th century, the legend of a city swallowed by the desert had migrated from folklore to screens, books, and magazines, reshaped again and again to satisfy the enduring appetite for tales of vanished worlds. What began as a fortified outpost in the desert has become one of the most repeated metaphors of human fascination with loss, mystery, and survival. The rediscovery narrative of the early 1990s, when NASA satellite imagery helped trace caravan routes across Oman's Dhofar region and led to excavations at Shizr, sparked global media attention. In 1992, headlines hailed the lost city of Ubar, placing it alongside Atlantis and Troy in the pantheon of rediscovered wonders. National Geographic and Time magazine ran features that framed the find as a triumph of science meeting legend, while television networks commissioned documentaries that dramatized the story of a fortress collapsing into the sands. For audiences worldwide, the name Ubar suddenly carried weight, not because of the fortress walls still standing in Oman, but because the story of their rediscovery was broadcast into millions of homes. In literature, Ubar gained traction in both historical and fictional accounts. Writers of archaeological thrillers used the name as shorthand for mystery. The blending of fact and speculation turned Ubar into a stage for stories about lost civilizations, hidden riches, and divine punishment. Academic publications, by contrast, sought to strip away exaggeration. Jurists who worked directly on the Shizr site argued that Ubar should be understood not as a singular city but as a regional trading system. Yet, the popular imagination rarely follows archaeological caution. Instead, it seized on Lawrence of Arabia's old phrase, Atlantis of the sands, a metaphor powerful enough to endure even when scholars challenged its accuracy. Television and film capitalized on the enduring appeal. Documentaries aired on the BBC, PBS, and Discovery Channel throughout the 1990s and 2000s framed Ubar as the city found by satellite. The fusion of cutting-edge technology with ancient legend provided irresistible drama. The story was not only about ruins but about the modern tools that had made their detection possible: remote sensing, ground-penetrating radar, and satellite imaging. In this sense, Ubar became a symbol of how archaeology was changing. The romance of desert expeditions merged with the precision of space-age science, capturing imaginations far beyond academic circles. Video games and popular culture absorbed the myth as well. The city of Ubar appeared as a central location in the 2011 video game Uncharted 3: Drake's Deception, where it was depicted as a vast, treasure-filled ruin hidden beneath the sands of the Rub al-Khali. Though entirely fictionalized, this adaptation cemented Ubar in the minds of younger audiences as a counterpart to El Dorado and Atlantis. The fact that a modest fortress in Oman could be transformed into a sprawling digital metropolis speaks to the elasticity of myth when filtered through entertainment. Yet, the fascination with Ubar is not merely escapist. It reflects a deeper human attraction to deserts and the idea of what they conceal. The Arabian desert has always symbolized both endurance and fragility. Civilizations that flourished there, Hadramaut, Kataban, Saba, and Himyar, rose on the wealth of incense trade but remained vulnerable to environmental collapse, shifting trade routes, and political upheaval. Ubar's legend captures that fragility. A settlement that relied on water sources and caravan traffic could not survive if either failed. The sinkhole at Shizr provided a geological explanation for collapse, but the legend translated that collapse into a moral lesson. In this way, Ubar became a reminder not only of lost wealth but of the precarious balance required for life in the desert. The legacy of Ubar is also entwined with identity. For Arabs, particularly in Oman and Yemen, the myth underscores the antiquity and significance of their lands in global history. The incense trade once made southern Arabia indispensable to empires stretching from Rome to India. To have a legendary city swallowed by the sands is to carry a story that speaks to both pride and humility. It affirms the greatness of ancestors while warning of the dangers of excess. For Western audiences, by contrast, Ubar became part of the larger catalog of lost cities that promised wonder and revelation. This dual identity, local moral tale and global mystery, ensured the legend's survival across cultures. Archaeology continues to refine the picture. Excavations and surveys in Oman and Yemen show that the incense trade was supported not by singular cities of immense size, but by a network of fortified posts, villages, and ports that connected mountains to markets. Shizr's importance lay in its position at a crossroads and its access to a vital water source. Its fortress controlled the flow of caravans and taxed the incense passing through. Its collapse into a sinkhole made it memorable in local tradition. But the broader Ubar may be understood as the entire system of trade, a system that reached its peak between the 3rd century BCE and the 2nd century CE before declining under the combined pressure of Roman shifts in trade routes, climate changes, and the eventual spread of Christianity and Islam, which diminished the ritual demand for incense. The persistence of the Ubar legend shows how history is remembered not in proportion to scale but in proportion to meaning. Shizr was not Rome, Petra, or Palmyra. It was small in size and scope, yet the collapse of its fortress was given the weight of divine punishment in memory. That memory, amplified by modern media, ensured that Ubar would be remembered not for what it truly was but for what people needed it to symbolize. A reminder of fragility, a symbol of human arrogance, a mystery that survived because the desert swallowed more than stone. It preserved a story that could be retold and reshaped by every generation. Even today, Ubar's name is invoked in articles, documentaries, and popular retellings as shorthand for the allure of lost places. Archaeologists continue to correct misconceptions, stressing the importance of context and caution, yet they acknowledge that myth has its own endurance. For the public, Ubar remains both fortress and fable, both caravan station and Atlantis of the sands. That tension between faith, legend, and archaeology is the true legacy of Ubar. It stands as a reminder that the past is never entirely recoverable, that what is unearthed in stone often differs from what survives in story, and that lost cities endure not because of what they were, but because of what humanity needs them to be.